My parents handed out pristine white boxes containing the newest tablets and thick envelopes stuffed with $100 bills to every single grandchild in the room except one. My 7-year-old daughter Chloe stood there completely empty-handed, pulling at my sleeve with tears welling in her eyes, whispering to ask if she did something bad. I did not cry. I did not scream. I quietly took her home. But the next morning at exactly 7 in the morning, I showed up at their front door to serve the foreclosure papers on their multi-million-dollar mansion. My name is Maya. I am 34 years old, and I learned the hard way that sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply letting toxic people destroy themselves. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your child from family members who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the Williams household meant understanding that love was a transaction and appearances were the only currency that mattered. Walking into my parents' sprawling estate that Easter Sunday felt like stepping onto a movie set where everyone knew their lines perfectly, except for me. The living room was a masterclass in aggressive wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers caught the late afternoon light reflecting off polished silver serving trays and pristine marble floors. I held Chloe's small hand tightly in mine, guiding her through a sea of extended family members, church elders and networking acquaintances who barely offered us more than tight, obligatory smiles. We were the family charity cases, or so they confidently believed. My younger sister Kiara was holding court near the massive stone fireplace. She wore a custom designer pastel dress that probably cost more than what she assumed my monthly rent was. She was laughing loudly, making sure every single person in the room noticed her perfect blowout and the massive diamond ring sparkling on her finger. Right beside her stood her husband, Bradley. He was a white startup chief executive officer and the undisputed golden boy of the Williams family. My parents worshipped the ground Bradley walked on. To my father, Marcus, and my mother, Denise, having him for a son-in-law was the ultimate status symbol. It elevated their standing in their elite circles, and they practically tripped over themselves to cater to his every whim, constantly bragging to anyone who would listen about his latest supposed venture capital funding rounds. I, on the other hand, was the designated family disappointment. They genuinely believed I was just a low-level administrative worker struggling to make ends meet as a single mother. I never corrected them. I never told them that the venture capital firm I founded was currently managing assets worth tens of millions of dollars. I preferred the absolute peace of being underestimated over the sheer exhaustion of their constant financial demands and relentless judgment. But keeping that secret meant silently enduring their condescension at every single family gathering. As Chloe and I walked past the fireplace, Bradley caught my eye and offered a sickeningly pitying smile. "Maya, I am so glad you could make it," he said, raising his voice just enough so the surrounding relatives would tune in. "We were just talking about my company's new expansion. If things get too tight for you with inflation right now, let me know. We might have some data entry positions opening up soon. It pays slightly above minimum wage, but it could really help you and the kid out." Kiara giggled into her champagne glass, a sharp mocking sound. My mother, who had just walked up carrying a tray of expensive appetizers, nodded in vigorous agreement. "You should really take him up on that, Maya. It is incredibly generous of Bradley to offer charity to family. You cannot be too proud when you are struggling." I simply smiled, my most polite, vacant smile, and said I would think about it, tightening my protective grip on Chloe's hand. I knew exactly what Bradley's company was really worth, but today was not the day to drop that bomb. The dining table groaned under the weight of a catered feast, but the real spectacle of the afternoon was reserved for after lunch. The annual Easter gift exchange was my mother's absolute favorite way to assert her dominance and show off her immense generosity to her preferred children. She commanded everyone to gather in the formal living room. Chloe squeezed my hand, her brown eyes wide with innocent excitement. She had spent the entire morning sitting at our kitchen table, drawing a beautiful Easter card for her grandparents. She had poured all her 7-year-old love into the crooked, glittery letters and brightly colored bunny rabbits. She clutched that piece of folded construction paper against her chest, like it was pure gold, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to present it to them. My father stood in the center of the Persian rug, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch, while my mother began handing out the gifts. The room buzzed with anticipation. It started with Kiara and Bradley's 3 children. My mother handed over sleek white rectangular boxes. The kids tore into them, aggressively ripping the expensive wrapping paper and tossing it carelessly onto the floor to reveal the newest model tablets. They did not even offer a simple thank you before powering them on. Next came the thick white envelopes. I could see the crisp $100 bills peeking out from the unsealed flaps. My parents showered them with praise, bending down to kiss their cheeks, calling them the smartest, most beautiful grandchildren in the entire world. The room echoed with polite applause from the extended family, validating my parents' grand display of wealth and success. Chloe stood patiently at the very edge of the rug. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, her eyes tracking my mother's every movement, waiting for her name to be called. I watched my mother pick up a gift bag and walk right past my daughter to hand it to a second cousin twice removed. I watched my father look directly at Chloe, make brief eye contact with her hopeful face, and then purposefully turn his back to pour himself a glass of bourbon from the bar cart. The exclusion was not a mistake. It was not a simple oversight in a busy, crowded room. It was a calculated, deliberate act of emotional cruelty meant to put me in my place and remind me of my lowly status in their hierarchy. The room buzzed with loud conversations and the sounds of Kiara's children fighting loudly over their new electronics. The gift-giving was officially over. My mother dusted off her hands and announced that dessert would be served shortly in the dining room. There was no box for Chloe. There was no envelope of cash. There was not even a cheap plastic egg filled with jelly beans. I looked down at my daughter. Her small shoulders slumped forward, and the hand holding the glittery handmade card dropped heavily to her side. Her bottom lip trembled as her young mind processed what had just happened in front of a room full of people. She did not throw a tantrum like Kiara's kids would have done. She did not demand attention or cry out for a gift. Instead, she looked up at me, her big brown eyes swimming with unshed tears that broke my heart into a million pieces. She gave my sleeve a gentle, hesitant tug and whispered the words that would ultimately seal my family's fate. "Mama, did I do something bad?" In that exact moment, the last remaining thread of loyalty I had for the Williams family snapped clean in two. I looked at the people who were supposed to love us unconditionally, laughing and drinking, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just crushed a little girl's spirit. I realized then that trying to earn their respect was a fool's errand. They did not deserve my daughter, and they certainly did not deserve the protection my silence had afforded them. I crouched down until I was exactly eye level with my daughter. I took her face in my hands, making sure she was looking directly at me and not at the room full of adults who had just failed her so miserably. "You are perfect," I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady so she would not hear the absolute rage boiling in my veins. "You did absolutely nothing wrong, my sweet girl. Some people are just too poor in their hearts to appreciate something as beautiful as your card." I took the glittery construction paper from her trembling fingers and tucked it safely into my purse like a sacred relic. Then I stood up, squared my shoulders, and smoothed down my dress. Kiara had been watching us from her spot by the fireplace. Seeing me comfort my child apparently offended her delicate sensibilities. She strutted over her expensive heels, clicking loudly against the marble floor, swirling the champagne in her crystal glass. She wore a smug, self-satisfied smirk that I had seen 1,000 times before. "Oh, please do not start the waterworks." Kiara sighed loudly, ensuring the entire room was listening. "Do not act so bitter. Just because you are struggling and cannot afford to buy nice gifts for Mom and Dad like Bradley and I can, does not mean you have to ruin the holiday mood for the rest of us. It is just a gift exchange. Teach your kid not to be so entitled." Bradley wrapped an arm around Kiara's waist, nodding in agreement. "She is right, Maya. Kids need to learn that they do not get a trophy just for existing. It builds character." My father Marcus cleared his throat from across the room. "We already do enough for you, Maya. Do not make this about you. We wanted to reward the grandchildren who are actually learning the value of hard work and success." My mother Denise stepped forward, adjusting her heavy diamond necklace. If you worked a little harder instead of settling for that dead-end administrative job, maybe you could afford to spoil your daughter too. Do not project your financial insecurities onto our family celebration. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or even yesterday, I would have fought back. I would have raised my voice, defended my work ethic, and tried desperately to make them see my worth. I would have explained that I worked 60-hour weeks, that I was a good mother, that I was trying my absolute best to provide. I would have given them the exact reaction they craved. They wanted a loud scene. They wanted me to look unhinged, emotional, and pathetic in front of their wealthy friends, the church elders, and their perfect son-in-law. They wanted to prove to the entire room that I was the unstable, jealous sister they always claimed I was. But today I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not shout. I did not defend my career. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I looked at Kiara, then at Bradley, and finally at my parents. I let a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of submission. It was the smile of a predator realizing its prey had just walked willingly into a cage. I let the silence stretch. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. In a room packed with people, the sudden absence of noise was deafening. The clinking of glasses stopped entirely. The quiet murmurs of the extended family died down to an uncomfortable hush. The absolute stillness forced everyone to focus entirely on the space between us. My silence was a mirror holding up their cruelty for everyone to see, and they did not like the reflection staring back at them. My father shifted uncomfortably, his confident posture breaking as he reached up to adjust his collar. My mother's triumphant smirk faltered quickly, replaced by a nervous, confused frown. They had anticipated a screaming match, a tearful exit, or a pathetic plea for their acceptance. My total lack of emotional response terrified them. It stripped them of their power. "Are you not going to say anything?" Kiara demanded, her voice suddenly sounding shrill and incredibly insecure in the quiet room. I kept that cold, calculating smile on my face. "I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon," I said softly. My tone was terrifyingly polite, completely void of any warmth or familial affection. It was the voice of a chief executive officer addressing a soon-to-be-terminated employee. I turned my back on them, picked up Chloe's small coat from the entryway bench, and helped her slip her arms into the sleeves. I did not rush. I took my sweet time adjusting her collar and buttoning her jacket, forcing my family to stand there and watch me dismiss them entirely. "Let us go, sweetheart," I said, taking Chloe's hand securely in mine. "We have much better things to do today." As I walked toward the heavy oak front door, I could feel the suffocating tension I left in my wake. My mother called out my name, her tone carrying a sharp edge of panic rather than authority. "Maya, you march back here right now. We are not finished talking to you." I did not stop. I did not even turn my head. I simply opened the door, stepped out into the crisp spring air, and pulled it shut behind me with a firm, definitive click. Through the thick glass windows bordering the entryway, I could see the immediate fallout of my departure. My parents were visibly flustered. They had intended to showcase their dominance to Bradley and their country club friends, demonstrating how firmly they ruled their household and how graciously they tolerated their failure of a daughter. Instead, they had just publicly bullied a 7-year-old girl and were met with pure, unadulterated disdain. My refusal to engage made them look petty, cruel, and ultimately weak. I saw Bradley looking at his in-laws with a distinct expression of discomfort, clearly unsettled by the bizarre and toxic family dynamic he had just witnessed. Losing face in front of Bradley was my parents' worst nightmare, and my silence had accomplished exactly that. My father was hastily pouring himself another drink, trying to laugh off the heavy tension in the room while my mother furiously whispered something into Kiara's ear. The perfect Easter Sunday illusion had shattered completely. I buckled Chloe into her car seat, kissed her forehead, and promised her we were going to get the biggest ice cream sundae in the city. As I walked around to the driver's side of my modest sedan, I pulled my phone from my purse. I opened my encrypted business email and drafted a quick, decisive message to my lead legal counsel. The subject line was simple: initiate aggressive collection on the Innovate Tech debt tomorrow morning. Zero leniency. I hit send, started the engine, and drove away from the sprawling estate. They had enjoyed their little moment of power today, but tomorrow, at exactly 7 in the morning, their entire world was going to collapse. The crisp morning air bit at my cheeks as I pulled my car into the sprawling circular driveway of my parents' estate. The dashboard clock glowed bright white, displaying exactly 6:55 in the morning. The neighborhood was dead silent, enveloped in that thick, expensive quiet that only gated communities possess. There were no children playing no lawnmowers, humming just the pristine, manicured silence of people who believed their wealth insulated them from the real world. I turned off the ignition and stepped out of the vehicle. I had not slept a single hour yet. I had never felt more awake, more energized, or more completely in control. I smoothed down the front of my tailored charcoal suit. It was a sharp contrast to the worn-out cardigans and faded jeans they were so accustomed to seeing me wear. I retrieved the thick, heavy manila folder from the passenger seat. As I walked toward the grand entrance, my heels clicked rhythmically against the cobblestone path. I held my head high, my posture rigidly straight. With every step up those wide, sweeping concrete stairs, the old Maya, the submissive, quiet daughter who constantly absorbed their abuse, withered away and vanished. The woman ascending those steps was a creditor coming to collect a massive debt. At exactly 7 o'clock, I reached the massive mahogany front doors. I did not bother knocking gently. I pressed my thumb hard against the brass doorbell and held it there. The loud melodic chimes echoed violently through the cavernous house, ringing over and over again in a relentless, demanding loop. I knew my parents cherished their leisurely Sunday sleep-ins, especially after hosting one of their exhausting social events. I did not care. I kept my thumb pressed firmly against the button. A full minute passed before I heard the heavy thud of footsteps approaching from the other side. The deadbolt clicked loudly, and the door was yanked open. My father stood there, his face flushed red with fresh anger. He was wearing his expensive silk pajamas, his hair rumpled, his eyes narrowed into a furious glare. He opened his mouth fully prepared to unleash a tirade on whatever delivery driver or neighborhood nuisance had dared to disrupt his morning peace. When his eyes finally focused and landed on me, the angry shout died in his throat. It was immediately replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated annoyance. "Maya," he barked, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. "What on earth is wrong with you? Do you have any idea what time it is? Have you completely lost your mind? Stop ringing that bell before you wake up Bradley and Kiara. They are sleeping in the guest wing and need their rest." He stepped forward, puffing out his chest, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me right back down the stairs, just like he had done 1,000 times before. He expected me to flinch. He expected me to lower my eyes, stammer out a pathetic apology, and nervously explain why I was there. Instead, I stepped directly into his space. I did not break eye contact. I did not slow my pace. I forced him to step backward into the foyer just to avoid colliding with me. "Move," I said. The word was not a request. It was an absolute command delivered with a flat, icy authority that made him blink in shock. I brushed past him, the fabric of my suit brushing against his silk pajamas, and strode purposefully into the grand foyer. The remnants of yesterday's extravagant Easter celebration were still scattered around the room. Empty champagne flutes sat abandoned on end tables. Discarded gift boxes and torn luxury wrapping paper littered the edges of the expensive Persian rug. It looked exactly like what it was, the messy aftermath of a ridiculous performance. My father scrambled to close the front door, his bare feet slapping against the marble floor as he hurried after me. "How dare you barge into my house like this?" he hissed, trying to keep his voice down so he would not wake his precious golden child upstairs. "You made an absolute fool of yourself yesterday with your dramatic silent exit. We are not doing this today. You will turn around, march right back out that door, and you will not come back until you are ready to grovel and apologize to your mother and your sister." I stopped walking when I reached the center of the foyer, right beside the massive custom-built marble console table my mother loved to show off to her guests. I turned around slowly to face him. He was out of breath, his face contorted into a familiar mask of patriarchal rage. He pointed a shaking finger toward the door, waiting for my compliance. I lifted the thick manila folder I had been carrying. I raised it up, making sure he saw exactly how heavy it was, and then I slammed it down onto the solid marble surface. The sound was deafening. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot through the silent, cavernous house, bouncing off the high ceilings and the crystal chandelier. It was a sharp, violent noise that completely shattered the morning quiet. I heard a gasp from the top of the grand staircase. My mother, wrapped in a plush robe, was clutching the banister, looking down at the foyer with wide, startled eyes. A door clicked open down the hallway, signaling that Bradley and Kiara were finally awake. The audience was assembling, which was exactly what I wanted. I placed my hands flat on top of the folder, leaning my weight forward, dominating the space in a house where I had always been treated like a ghost. I looked my father dead in the eyes, watching his confident, angry facade begin to crack under the weight of my absolute calm. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. He stared at the folder, then up at my face, trying desperately to reconcile the woman standing before him with the daughter he thought he knew. He was searching for any trace of the timid girl who used to crave his validation. He found absolutely nothing. I was a brick wall, entirely impenetrable and completely unmoved by his outrage. I watched the realization slowly wash over him that his usual tactics of intimidation were failing entirely. "I am not here to apologize," I said, my voice projecting clearly, so the people hovering on the stairs could hear every single syllable. "I am here to collect. Here." My mother descended the grand staircase with the speed and fury of a disturbed hornet. Her heavy silk robe billowed behind her, and her face was contorted into a mask of absolute outrage. She gripped the polished wooden banister so tightly her knuckles had turned completely white. From the moment she laid eyes on me standing in her foyer, she was already winding up to deliver a verbal beating that she fully expected would force me into submission. "What is wrong with you?" she shrieked, her voice echoing sharply against the marble walls and soaring up to the vaulted ceilings. "How dare you come into this house and make demands like a common thug? After the absolute tantrum you threw yesterday, walking out on your own family during a sacred holiday without so much as a goodbye. You ruin Easter Sunday, and now you have the sheer audacity to show up here at the crack of dawn to harass your father." I stood my ground, my hands resting lightly on the thick manila folder on the console table. I watched her perform her usual theatrics. For my entire life, this was her primary tactic. If she yelled loudly enough, if she acted offended enough, everyone around her would instantly apologize just to keep the peace. But today, the peace was already dead, and I had no intention of resurrecting it. "You are acting like a petulant, jealous child," my mother continued, marching straight up to me until she was standing inches from my face. "You are 34 years old, Maya. You are a grown woman throwing a massive fit because we did not buy your daughter a stupid toy. Do you have any idea how selfish you are?" "It was not about a toy, Mother," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and even, letting the coldness of my tone contrast sharply with her frantic energy. "It was about you deliberately making a 7-year-old girl feel completely invisible in front of a room full of strangers. It was about you looking right at your own granddaughter and choosing to crush her spirit just to prove a point to me." My mother waved her hand through the air dismissively, as if she were swatting away a minor annoyance. "Oh, please stop with the dramatics. Chloe is fine. She will survive not getting an expensive gadget. You are the one who is wildly insecure. You always have been. If you must know, since you are clearly too dense to understand complex adult matters, Bradley is going through a very stressful transitional period right now." She leaned in, lowering her voice just a fraction, though still projecting loudly enough for my father to hear every word. She wanted to make sure she successfully painted herself as the ultimate supportive mother to her preferred child. "Innovate Tech is expanding globally," she stated proudly, gesturing vaguely toward the upper floor where Bradley and Kiara were staying. "That requires massive capital. Bradley is a visionary, and he is dealing with temporary cash flow difficulties because he is making high-level executive decisions that someone with your limited administrative background could never possibly comprehend." Kiara has been so stressed trying to maintain their upscale household while his corporate funds are temporarily tied up in restructuring. Your father and I simply wanted to give Kiara's children a beautiful Easter to distract them from the massive pressure their parents are under. We had to prioritize them. You only have one child and you are entirely used to struggling and scraping by. Kiara is not. Kiara deserves to maintain her lifestyle. My eyes darted from my mother's self-righteous, furious face to the top of the stairs. Kiara was now standing on the landing, clutching the lapels of her own expensive designer robe, playing the perfect fragile victim. Bradley stood right behind Kiara, running a hand nervously through his hair, looking incredibly tense at the sudden mention of his corporate finances. I looked back at my mother. Difficulties. I repeated the word slowly, tasting the absolute absurdity of it on my tongue. I took a deliberate step closer to my mother, forcing her to actually tilt her head up to maintain eye contact with me. You want to stand here and talk to me about difficulties? Let us talk about the exact kind of difficulties this family considers acceptable. My mother crossed her arms over her chest, lifting her chin defiantly. I will not be lectured by you in my own home. You will listen to every single word I have to say. I snapped, my voice finally rising just enough to command absolute obedience from the room. The sudden shift in my tone made both my mother and my father physically flinch. Because when your precious Kiara started dating Bradley, she simply had to go to France with him for the summer. Bradley came from a wealthy family, and Kiara needed to prove that the Williams family was just as elite. But you and Dad had just blown all of your liquid cash on renewing your luxury country club membership to impress your friends. I saw Kiara shift uncomfortably on the stairs, but I did not break eye contact with my mother. Do you remember my sophomore year of college? I asked, my voice dropping back to a lethal whisper. Because I remember it vividly. I was working 2 part-time jobs just to afford my textbooks, my groceries, and my share of rent in a tiny freezing apartment. I had that beat-up, rusted Honda Civic that I bought with my own money from waitressing double shifts at a diner. It was my only lifeline. It was the only way I could get from my campus on one side of the city to my night shift on the other. We are not talking about ancient history, Maya, my mother hissed, trying to deflect. She knew exactly where this was going, and she hated being exposed. We are talking about exactly that. I shot back, taking another step forward. So what did you do, Mother? You cornered me in my cramped apartment. You demanded that I sell my car and give the cash directly to Kiara so she could afford designer luggage and first-class plane tickets to Paris. You said it was an emergency. You said Bradley needed to see that Kiara was cultured and wealthy, or else he might leave her. My father looked away suddenly, finding the marble tiles beneath his feet incredibly interesting. When I refused, I continued, the memories burning hot in my chest, but my delivery remaining ice cold. When I told you I desperately needed that car to survive and keep my jobs so I would not get evicted, what did you say to me? My mother pressed her lips tightly together, refusing to answer. I will tell you what you said, I announced to the silent foyer. You told me that if I did not sacrifice my only mode of transportation for the family's reputation, you would instantly cut off my health insurance and officially disown me. I had severe asthma, and you knew I could not afford my inhalers without that insurance. You said my minimum wage jobs were meaningless anyway, because I was never going to amount to anything more than a glorified secretary. You forced a 20-year-old college student to sell her only lifeline so your golden child could drink champagne under the Eiffel Tower and impress a boy. The silence in the house was so thick it felt suffocating. I did not let them breathe. I pressed the advantage, pouring every ounce of the pain they had caused me into my words. I spent that entire winter waking up at 4 a.m. to catch 2 different public buses in the freezing rain and snow. I walked miles in the dark just to get to work. I failed my morning classes because I could not physically make it to campus on time after working until 2 a.m. I ate ramen noodles and skipped meals for months, while Kiara sent us daily photo updates of her eating escargot and shopping at luxury boutiques with the money you stole from me. You sacrificed my health, my education, and my safety to fund a romantic European vacation. I pointed a finger directly at my mother's chest, stopping just an inch away from her silk robe. So do not stand there in your custom silk robe and lecture me about Bradley's cash flow difficulties. Do not dare look me in the eye and tell me that I am supposed to accept you emotionally abusing my 7-year-old daughter because your favorite son-in-law is bad at managing his startup budget. You have always prioritized their luxury over my basic survival. You have always treated my pain as the acceptable price for their happiness. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but her usual sharp retorts had completely abandoned her. Her eyes darted wildly around the foyer, searching for an excuse, a justification, or a way to turn the narrative back in her favor. She looked up at Kiara, hoping her golden child would jump to her defense, but Kiara was gripping the banister, looking pale and completely exposed. "You think you are protecting them by treating me like garbage?" I said, finally stepping back and letting my hand rest once again on the thick manila folder on the table. "But the truth is, you are just proving what I have known for years. You are not a mother. You are an investor, and you put all of your money into a failing asset." The heavy silence that followed my words was finally broken by the slow, deliberate padding of expensive suede slippers descending the grand staircase. I did not move my body. I simply shifted my gaze upward, looking over my own shoulder to watch the descent. Bradley was making his grand entrance. He walked down the sweeping curve of the stairs with the unhurried, arrogant cadence of a man who firmly believed he owned not just the house, but the very air we were all breathing. He wore tailored linen lounge pants and a crisp, perfectly fitted Henley shirt that screamed effortless casual wealth. One hand rested in his pocket while the other was draped protectively over Kiara's shoulder. Kiara clung to his side like a fragile, distressed damsel. She had seemingly recovered from the shock of my verbal assault on our mother and had immediately sought refuge behind her husband's perceived power. Her chin was tilted upward again, and that familiar, insufferable smirk had crept back onto her perfectly contoured face. With Bradley by her side, she felt completely invincible. My parents physically sagged with relief at the sight of him. My father literally took a step back, deferring the confrontation to the younger, wealthier man he viewed as the true patriarch of this family. The dynamic was sickeningly transparent. To my parents, Bradley was not just a successful tech chief executive officer. He was a white man of means who had chosen their daughter, elevating their own social standing in the process. They worshipped his proximity to power and privilege. My mother dabbed at her dry eyes, looking up at Bradley as if a knight in shining armor had just ridden in to slay the unruly dragon that was her eldest daughter. Bradley paused on the third step from the bottom, deliberately maintaining the high ground, so he could literally and metaphorically look down on me. He offered me a tight, practiced smile. It was the exact same patronizing expression he probably used when rejecting junior developers pitching ideas in his boardroom. It was a look completely devoid of actual empathy, masking a deep, unshakable superiority complex. "Maya, let us all just take a deep breath and dial the temperature down in here," Bradley said. His voice was smooth calm and coated in a thick layer of condescension. "There is absolutely no need to march in here and make a massive scene over a few children's gifts. We are all family. We are all on the same team." I stared up at him, maintaining my absolute stillness. The sheer audacity of this man, a man who had married into my family and eagerly participated in my exclusion, attempting to moderate my entirely justified anger, was staggering. He spoke to me slowly, articulating his words with exaggerated patience, treating me not as a 34-year-old woman, but as an irrational, hysterical teenager who simply needed to be managed by a rational adult. "Look, I understand that things have been tough for you," Bradley continued, taking one more step down, but keeping his physical distance. "The economy is brutal right now, especially for single mothers working administrative jobs. It is stressful. We get it. But coming into your parents' home and screaming about events that happened over a decade ago is not productive. It is just projecting your current financial frustrations onto them. They love you, Maya. They just want peace." Kiara nodded vigorously, leaning her head against his bicep. "She is just projecting, Bradley. She has always been like this. She cannot handle the fact that we are actually building a future while she is stuck in the exact same place she has always been." I let her words hang in the air, refusing to take the bait. My eyes remained locked on Bradley. He gave his wife a gentle, reassuring squeeze before turning his attention back to me, adopting a look of profound, sickening pity. It was the ultimate white savior performance, executed flawlessly, in the foyer of a house his in-laws were currently risking everything to keep. Tell you what, Bradley said, his tone softening into what he clearly believed was a magnanimous, heroic offer. I do not want bad blood in this family. I hate seeing Kiara upset, and I hate seeing your parents distressed. If you are struggling with Chloe's expenses, just tell me. If you are behind on her school tuition or rent or whatever it is that has you so wound up this morning, I can help. I will write you a check right now. Just name a reasonable number. We can clear this up. You can apologize to Marcus and Denise for the disruption, and we can all move on with our Sunday. He reached into the pocket of his linen pants, as if preparing to pull out a designer pen and a checkbook he did not actually have on him. It was a purely theatrical gesture. He wanted to show my parents that he was the benevolent provider, the wealthy patriarch willing to throw a few scraps to the struggling, less fortunate sister-in-law just to maintain the peace. He wanted to buy my silence. He wanted to purchase my submission. My mother let out a loud, dramatic sigh of appreciation. Do you see that, Maya? Do you see how incredibly generous Bradley is being to you after the way you just spoke to us? You should be thanking him on your hands and knees. Not many men would offer to bail out their unruly sister-in-law out of the goodness of their hearts. My father chimed in, finding his courage now that his golden son-in-law was steering the ship. You really need to swallow your immense pride and take the help, Maya. Bradley is offering you a way out of this embarrassing situation. Take the money for your daughter, apologize to your mother, and go home to cool off. You are embarrassing yourself. I stood motionless at the base of the stairs looking at the four of them. They had formed a perfect, impenetrable wall of delusion. They truly believed that wealth was the only metric of human value, and because they assumed I had none, they believed I had no right to demand respect. Bradley was looking down at me with that gentle, condescending smile, fully expecting me to crumble. He expected me to weigh my pride against my supposed poverty and ultimately surrender to his charity. He thought his imaginary money was the ultimate trump card in any conflict. The comedic irony of the situation was almost too delicious to bear. Here was a man offering to write me a check to cover my daughter's basic needs, a man whose entire corporate existence was currently hanging by a thread that I personally held the scissors to. He was standing on the staircase of a mansion that had been secretly mortgaged to the hilt just to keep his sinking startup afloat. He was offering me a financial lifeline from an account that I knew for an absolute fact was currently frozen solid by his creditors. I slowly ran my hand over the smooth, thick cover of the manila folder resting on the marble console table. Inside this folder were the legal documents that proved his entire life was a fragile house of cards, and I was the storm that was about to blow it all away. I did not need to scream. I did not need to defend my bank account or my career. I just needed to let him keep digging his own grave with his arrogant, misplaced confidence. I looked at Bradley, matching his condescending smile with a chilling, vacant one of my own. I let my eyes slowly travel down to the pocket where his hand rested, waiting for the perfect moment to completely decimate his ego. Before Bradley could even attempt to pull out his imaginary checkbook, the absolute stillness of the foyer was shattered by the sound of my father's heavy footsteps. Marcus Williams had reached his absolute limit. My refusal to break eye contact with his son-in-law, my blatant disregard for the natural hierarchy of this household, was an insult he could no longer tolerate. He marched across the marble floor, completely closing the physical distance between us, until he was standing barely an inch from my face. I stood perfectly still in the dead center of the grand entryway. The spatial dynamic of the room suddenly shifted, closing in on me from every possible angle. If a camera were circling us right now, it would capture a masterclass in psychological isolation. To my direct front stood my father, his chest heaving with suppressed rage, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles trembled. To my right stood my mother, her arms crossed firmly over her chest, her eyes narrowed in absolute disgust. To my left, elevated on the sweeping staircase, Bradley and Kiara hovered like royalty, observing a peasant uprising. I was entirely boxed in, surrounded by a unified front of people who shared my blood or my last name, but possessed absolutely zero loyalty to my well-being. "Take the money, Maya," my father ordered, his voice dropping into a dangerous gravelly register that he usually reserved for intimidating subordinate employees at his firm. "You will take the generous help that this man is offering you. You will express your profound gratitude, and then you will pack up your things and leave this property." I did not flinch. I kept my breathing slow and measured, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me intimidated. My father raised his hand, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly between my eyes. "You have come into my home on a sacred holiday weekend and done nothing but spread your miserable, toxic energy. You are standing in the presence of a man who is actively building an empire, a man who provides an exceptional life for your sister, and instead of showing respect, you show nothing but bitter, unchecked envy. The Williams family does not tolerate a daughter who is a failure, selfish, and jealous like you." The words echoed off the high ceilings, ringing with a harsh, brutal finality. A failure, selfish, jealous. For my entire life, those specific words had been the primary weapons my parents used to keep me compliant. Whenever I pursued a passion they deemed unprofitable, I was a failure. Whenever I asked for basic emotional support, I was selfish. Whenever I rightfully pointed out their blatant favoritism toward Kiara, I was jealous. They had conditioned me to shrink away from those labels, to apologize, to bend over backward trying to prove them wrong. But right now, standing in the center of their aggressive, coordinated attack, those words lost absolutely all of their power. They sounded hollow, empty, and incredibly desperate. "You are a 34-year-old woman who still cannot provide a decent holiday for her own child," my father continued ruthlessly, digging into what he assumed was my deepest vulnerability. "You think you are taking some sort of moral high ground by standing here glaring at us, but you are just proving how utterly incompetent you are. Bradley is offering you a lifeline. He is offering to fix your mistakes out of the goodness of his heart. A real mother would swallow her pathetic pride and take the check so her daughter does not have to suffer for her failures." That was the exact moment the final lock clicked into place inside my mind. He was using Chloe against me. He was weaponizing my love for my daughter to justify his own cruelty. My mother chimed in from the sidelines, eager to reinforce my father's attack. "Your father is entirely right, Maya. You are acting like a complete martyr, and it is honestly exhausting to watch. We have built a legacy in this community. We have a reputation to maintain. We cannot have you showing up looking like a complete disaster and creating chaos simply because your own life has not turned out the way you wanted it to. You need to accept your position in this family." My position. That was the core of the issue. In their perfectly curated world, everyone had a designated role. Marcus was the wealthy, respected patriarch. Denise was the flawless, supportive matriarch. Kiara was the beautiful, successful golden child. Bradley was the brilliant, wealthy savior who validated their social climbing ambitions. And I was the designated loser. I was the dark background they used to make their own stars shine brighter. My sole purpose was to fail to struggle and to occasionally receive their condescending charity so they could feel benevolent. By standing here completely unbothered and refusing to play the victim, I was disrupting the entire ecosystem of their household. Bradley sighed heavily from his perch on the stairs, shaking his head with a look of manufactured sorrow. "I was just trying to help Marcus. I hate seeing families fight over financial stress. It is why I work so hard, so Kiara never has to feel this kind of desperation." My father looked up at Bradley with an expression of pure, unadulterated reverence. "I know, son. We appreciate you more than you know. You are the exact kind of man I always hoped my daughters would marry." He turned his attention back to me, and the warmth in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, hard disdain. "You are going to apologize to Bradley right now," my father demanded, stepping even closer, trying to use his height to force me to look up at him. "You are going to thank him for being gracious enough to overlook your ridiculous behavior. Then you are going to take whatever money he is willing to give you, and you are going to walk out that door. If you refuse, if you continue to stand here and disrespect this family, you are done. We will cut you off completely. Do not call us when you get evicted. Do not call us when you cannot afford groceries. You will be entirely on your own, and you will have absolutely no one to blame but your own bitter jealousy. I looked around the room one last time. I absorbed the full reality of my total isolation. There was not a single person in this grand, opulent space who viewed me as a human being worthy of basic dignity. They had stripped away every pretense of familial love. They had laid all their cards on the table, confidently betting that my fear of being abandoned would force me to fold. They were all waiting for my response. They were waiting for my shoulders to slump. They were waiting for the tears to finally spill over, for my voice to crack, for me to whisper a defeated apology, and extend a trembling hand to accept Bradley's imaginary charity. I did not break. I did not bend. I stood perfectly straight, grounded by a profound sense of liberation. The worst thing they could possibly do to me was reject me, and they had just done it completely and unapologetically. There was nothing left to fear. The absolute worst had already happened, and I was still standing. I was still breathing. I was still the smartest, most powerful person in the room, and they simply did not know it yet. I let out a slow, steady breath. I looked my father directly in the eyes, matching his furious glare with an expression of absolute terrifying calm. I was done letting them dictate the rules of engagement. I was done letting them project their own monumental insecurities onto me. The time for silent endurance was officially over. It was time to start dismantling their perfect illusion brick by expensive brick. I slowly reached my hand out, extending it toward Bradley, who immediately flashed a triumphant, knowing smile. He thought he had won. He thought I was reaching for the check. Instead, my fingers bypassed his general direction entirely and landed firmly on the thick manila folder resting on the marble console table. Bradley's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected me to reach out and beg. He had anticipated a tearful breakdown, a moment where my poverty would override my pride, allowing him to play the ultimate hero. When I did not immediately surrender, he decided to force the issue. With a heavy, highly performative sigh meant to showcase his exhausting patience, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a slim, custom leather checkbook and an expensive silver fountain pen. The scratching of this pen against the paper seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet foyer. He wrote with dramatic, sweeping strokes, making absolutely sure everyone in the room recognized his immense generosity and my pathetic need. My father visibly relaxed, his tense shoulders dropping as he watched the wealthy son-in-law handle his messy, impoverished daughter. My mother clasped her hands together in front of her chest, beaming up at Bradley with absolute adoration. To them, this was the perfect resolution. The wealthy man buys the problem away and the hierarchy remains perfectly intact. Bradley ripped the check from the booklet with a sharp, satisfying snap. He held it out toward me, pinching the corner of the crisp paper between his index finger and thumb. "Take it, Maya," he said, his voice dripping with artificial saccharine sympathy. "Buy Chloe something nice. Pay off your little credit cards. Just take the money, apologize to your parents, and let us all have a peaceful Sunday." I removed my hand from the thick manila folder. I slowly extended my arm and took the check from his grasp. A collective breath of relief swept through the room. Kiara smirked from her spot on the stairs, clearly satisfied that I had been bought and successfully put back in my place. My father took a step back, crossing his arms in victory. They genuinely believed that I had folded. They thought my pride had a concrete price tag and Bradley had just happily paid it. I looked down at the piece of paper in my hand. It was made out for $10,000. To my parents and my sister, it was a massive fortune designed to buy my permanent submission and validate their superiority. To me, it was a fraudulent piece of garbage. I raised my hands, holding the check right in front of my chest, so everyone in the room had a perfectly clear view of what I was about to do. My thumbs gripped the top edge of the paper. My index fingers pressed firmly against the back. With one swift, deliberate, and violent motion, I ripped the crisp paper straight down the middle. The sharp sound of the tearing paper cut through the room like a physical strike. My mother let out a loud, genuine gasp of horror, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. My father stiffened instantly, his eyes going wide with absolute, unadulterated disbelief. I did not stop. I placed the two torn halves together, lining up the severed edges perfectly. I gripped them tight and tore them again, ripping straight down the center. I reduced Bradley's grand, benevolent $10,000 gesture into 4 jagged, utterly useless pieces of trash. I opened my hands and let the pieces flutter slowly down through the air. I watched them drift and land scattered carelessly across the intricate patterns of my mother's expensive Persian rug. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The sheer audacity of destroying a $10,000 check in front of people who worshipped money completely short-circuited their brains. They were paralyzed by the unthinkable disrespect. It defied every single rule of the shallow universe they inhabited. I stepped right past my father, ignoring his shocked presence entirely. I closed the physical distance between myself and the bottom of the staircase until I was looking directly up into Bradley's stunned, paling face. The smug, condescending smile had completely vanished from his features, replaced by a tight, nervous grimace. I locked my eyes onto his. I did not blink. I did not waver. I let the full weight of my absolute authority bear down on him. "Which account are you planning to withdraw from Bradley?" I asked. My voice was no longer a quiet whisper. It was sharp, clear, and ringing with terrifying certainty, cutting through the dead silence of the foyer. "Your personal account that is already empty, or Innovate Tech's corporate account." I watched the exact moment his heart dropped into his stomach. The blood drained entirely from his face in a matter of seconds, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw slackened and his eyes darted frantically left and right, as if searching the grand foyer for a way out of a trap that had just snapped shut around his ankles. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He tried to maintain his composed posture, but his hands instinctively twitched at his sides. "What are you talking about?" Kiara demanded, stepping down one stair to stand slightly in front of her husband, acting as a human shield. Her voice was shrill, panicked, and fiercely defensive. "Are you completely insane? You just tore up $10,000. Bradley is worth millions. You are just a bitter, crazy woman making up desperate lies because you are broke and jealous." I did not look at my sister. I kept my gaze pinned entirely on Bradley, watching him sweat under the intense scrutiny. He tried to laugh, but the sound came out wet, choked, and incredibly forced. "I have absolutely no idea what you are rambling about, Maya." Bradley stammered, his voice completely lacking any of its previous smooth confidence. "You are clearly having some kind of severe mental breakdown. My accounts are perfectly fine. My company is thriving globally. You are just throwing out business buzzwords, trying to sound smart and intimidate us." "You are sweating, Bradley," I stated calmly, pointing out his physical reaction to the entire room. "If my words are just the crazy ramblings of a bitter, broke single mother, why are your hands shaking right now? Why did you just lose all the color in your face the second I mentioned your corporate accounts?" My father stepped forward, trying desperately to regain control of his hijacked house. "Maya, that is enough. I will not have you interrogating this man in my foyer. You have crossed every single line today. You tore up his charity, and now you are making wild, baseless accusations about his corporate finances. You are completely out of your mind." I did not break eye contact with my brother-in-law. I knew exactly what I was doing, and Bradley knew it too. He was terrified. He was looking at a woman he had spent years treating like a peasant, suddenly realizing she possessed the exact coordinates to his darkest, most closely guarded financial secrets. He was a fraud. He was a man drowning in a sea of hidden debt, desperately pretending to be a billionaire tech mogul just to impress a family of shallow social climbers. "You can lie to my parents, Bradley." I continued, my voice echoing with terrifying, unshakable certainty. "You can lie to your wife. You can buy them fancy dinners on credit and make them believe you are the absolute king of the world. But you cannot lie to the math. And you certainly cannot lie to me. I know exactly what is sitting in your personal checking account right now, and I know exactly what kind of illegal shell game you have been playing with your corporate funds just to keep up these ridiculous appearances." I let the brutal truth hang heavy in the air, watching him suffocate under the weight of his own massive deception. The battle had definitively shifted. I was no longer the victim defending my worth against their judgment. I was the executioner, and I was just getting started. I reached out and placed my hand flat against the heavy manila folder resting on the marble console table. I flipped the thick cover open. The crisp sound of the heavy cardstock seemed to suck the remaining oxygen straight out of the grand foyer. I did not rush. I let my fingers trace the edges of the neatly stacked papers inside, allowing Bradley to agonize over what exact piece of his destruction I was about to produce. I slid a single officially stamped document from the top of the pile. It bore the unmistakable, heavily embossed logo of his primary corporate banking institution. I held it up high, making sure the bold red letters printed across the top were perfectly visible to everyone standing on the staircase. Innovate Tech's account was frozen by the bank at exactly 4 in the afternoon last Friday, due to total insolvency, I read aloud. My voice was a surgical scalpel cutting straight through his elaborate fiction. The bank has officially initiated asset liquidation protocols. So I will ask you again, Bradley. Where exactly are you getting the money to write checks? The last remaining drops of color vanished from Bradley's face. He looked physically ill. The polished, untouchable tech chief executive officer was completely gone, instantly replaced by a desperate, cornered con artist. His breathing became incredibly shallow and erratic. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, choked wheeze escaped his throat. His hands, which he had previously stuffed into his tailored linen pockets to feign a relaxed posture, were now completely rigid. He pulled them out, his fingers twitching violently against his sides in rapid, uncontrollable spasms. He swiped a trembling palm across his forehead, desperately trying to wipe away the thick sheen of cold sweat that had suddenly materialized there. He was visibly unraveling. His eyes darted wildly around the room, jumping from the torn pieces of the check on the floor to my face, to the chandelier, and back to the documents in my hand. He looked exactly like a man searching for a physical escape route from a nightmare he was hopelessly trapped in. My father stepped forward, his heavy brow furrowing in deep rising confusion. "What is that paper, Maya? What do you mean his accounts are frozen due to insolvency?" "Bradley, what on earth is she talking about?" "It is a simple clerical error," Bradley stammered, his voice cracked mid-sentence, entirely losing its deep, resonant authority. He sounded frantic, breathless, and incredibly small. "It is a standard compliance audit, Marcus. You know how these massive international banking institutions operate? They freeze accounts temporarily during routine venture capital transitions just to verify large-scale wire transfers. It is a massive misunderstanding. It means absolutely nothing." "A standard compliance audit," I repeated, letting out a sharp, joyless laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "Is that the pathetic fairy tale you are currently selling to your board of directors too? Or did you forget to mention that the Department of Labor is also investigating you for 3 months of unpaid employee payroll?" I pulled another sheet of paper from the folder and tossed it onto the console table. "Because this compliance audit looks remarkably like a final eviction notice for your corporate headquarters in Silicon Valley. You have not paid your commercial rent in 4 months. Your landlord locked your employees out of the building on Thursday morning. They literally chained the glass doors shut, Bradley. Is that also a standard venture capital transition?" Bradley took a physical step backward, his shoulders slumping as his arrogant posture completely collapsed. He held his hands up in a defensive, placating gesture, his palms slick with nervous sweat. "Maya, you do not understand the tech sector. You are misinterpreting standard operational pivoting. We are engaging in an aggressive corporate restructuring phase. We are simply liquidating unnecessary physical assets to maximize our digital footprint and transition into a fully remote infrastructure. It is just a strategic liquidity bridge." "A strategic liquidity bridge," I echoed, shaking my head in pure disgust at his endless supply of corporate garbage. "You are broke, Bradley. You are completely, undeniably, and catastrophically bankrupt. You burned through $80 million of investor capital in less than 2 years on luxury corporate retreats, private jets, and a massively inflated executive payroll that you used to fund this ridiculous lifestyle to impress my parents." I pointed down at the 4 torn pieces of the $10,000 check resting on the Persian rug. You stood on that staircase looking down at me, offering to buy my daughter's happiness with phantom money that you do not even possess. You tried to humiliate me and play the ultimate white savior to my parents, using a bank account that is currently hundreds of thousands of dollars in the red. You are nothing but a fraud. Kiara pushed past her husband, her face twisted into a mask of pure hysterical denial. She marched down the remaining stairs, placing herself firmly between Bradley and me like a human shield. Shut up. Shut your jealous mouth right now, Maya. You forged all of these documents. You probably stayed up all night printing these out in your sad little apartment just to ruin our weekend because you cannot stand the fact that I married a successful man and you ended up with absolutely nothing. I shifted my gaze to my sister, looking at her with a mixture of icy pity and absolute contempt. Did I forge the warning call from your Black American Express card too, Kiara? Because I know for a fact that your primary credit card was declined at that luxury boutique downtown on Wednesday afternoon. You tried to buy a $3,000 handbag. The transaction was rejected for insufficient funds, and you ran out of the store crying in front of your friends. Kiara gasped, taking a physical step backward, as if I had just slapped her across the face. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth, and her eyes widened in absolute terror. She spun around to look at Bradley, silently demanding that he fix this, demanding that he tell her I was lying. But Bradley could not look at her. He stared down at his expensive suede slippers, his jaw trembling violently. The silence in the foyer was heavy, suffocating, and loaded with the radioactive truth. "Look at him, Kiara," I commanded, my voice slicing through her desperate denial. "Look at your brilliant, successful husband. Does he look like a man who just secured a new round of funding? Or does he look like a man who knows he is about to face federal fraud charges for lying to his investors?" My mother let out a small, strangled whimper. She grabbed my father's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging deep into his sleeve. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling with rising panic. "Marcus, tell her to stop. Tell her she is lying. Bradley, tell us she is making all of this up right now." But Bradley remained entirely mute. The sweat was now dripping freely down his temples, tracking along his jawline. His chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. The meticulously crafted illusion of his power had been entirely dismantled in less than 3 minutes. I watched the total collapse of his superiority with cold, clinical satisfaction. He had tried to buy my dignity with a worthless piece of paper. Now he was paying the ultimate price. The deafening silence broke with a sudden, violent shriek. Kiara lunged forward, moving so frantically that her expensive silk robe snapped sharply around her ankles. She closed the distance between us in a fraction of a second, snatching the official bank document right off the marble console table before I even had a chance to pull my hand away. The sudden chaotic movement shattered the frozen tableau in the grand foyer, instantly transforming the space from a quiet execution chamber into a loud, frantic theater of absolute denial. Kiara gripped the crisp paper with both hands, bringing it inches from her face. Her eyes darted wildly back and forth across the printed text, scanning the red ink and the bold, undeniable statements regarding Innovate Tech and its frozen assets. I watched the cognitive dissonance physically register on her features. She was reading the truth, but her brain absolutely refused to process the reality of it. To accept that document as real meant accepting that her entire luxury lifestyle, her perfect marriage, and her elevated social status were nothing but a massive, humiliating lie. And Kiara was entirely incapable of doing that. "This is fake!" Kiara screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. She threw her head back, her perfectly styled hair flying wildly over her shoulders. "This is a complete and utter forgery. You printed this yourself, Maya. You typed this up on your cheap little laptop in your sad, cramped apartment because you are a sick, twisted, jealous monster." She began waving the paper frantically in the air, turning toward our parents like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "Look at this, Mom. Look at what she did. She went out of her way to forge corporate bank documents just to ruin my Easter weekend. She is completely unhinged. She hates the fact that I married a brilliant, successful man while she is stuck scraping pennies together to feed her kid. She wants to drag us all down into her miserable, pathetic reality." My mother did not need any further convincing. The opportunity to turn me back into the villain was a lifeline she grabbed with both hands. Denise rushed across the foyer, her expensive slippers slapping against the floor, and immediately wrapped her arms protectively around Kiara's shoulders. She pulled her golden child close, glaring at me with a look of such profound venomous hatred that it would have shattered me a decade ago. You have crossed the line from being a bitter disappointment into being an actual sociopath, Maya. My mother hissed, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. To orchestrate a forgery just to sabotage a man who has shown you nothing but kindness. Bradley stood on those very stairs and offered you $10,000 to help your struggling daughter, and you repay him by fabricating disgusting financial rumors. You are severely mentally ill. You need to be institutionalized. She reached one hand out toward her son-in-law, who was still standing completely frozen on the bottom step, staring blankly at the floor. Bradley, sweetheart, do not even listen to a single word she says. My mother cooed, her tone shifting instantly from vicious to sickeningly sweet. We know she is disturbed. We know she is just projecting her own massive failures onto your incredible success. You have absolutely nothing to prove to someone like her. My father Marcus was quick to join the defensive perimeter. The brief moment of doubt I had seen in his eyes when I slammed the folder down was entirely gone, completely replaced by his usual authoritarian bluster. It was infinitely easier for him to believe that his eldest daughter was a pathological liar than to accept that he had been completely duped by a smooth-talking fraud. He puffed out his chest, stepping forward to block my view of Bradley, inserting his large frame between me and his prized son-in-law. I am calling the police, my father bellowed, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. What you are doing right now is criminal harassment, Maya. You are defaming a highly respected tech executive in his own home. You know absolutely nothing about the corporate world. You do not understand venture capital. You do not understand asset management. And you certainly do not understand men like Bradley. You are an administrative nobody who dropped out of the family standard a long time ago. How dare you waltz in here and pretend you have access to highly classified banking information? Kiara ripped the bank document in half, then into quarters, mimicking exactly what I had done to Bradley's worthless check. She threw the shredded pieces of paper directly at my chest. They fluttered down to join the remnants of the check on the Persian rug. You have always hated me, Kiara sobbed, forcing large crocodile tears to spill over her cheeks as she buried her face in our mother's shoulder. You have hated me since the day I got my acceptance letter to a real university while you were struggling to keep your head above water. You cannot stand that my husband is a visionary who provides me with a beautiful life. You probably scrounged together your last few paychecks to hire some cheap hacker to make these fake documents just to humiliate us. You are a terrible sister, and an even worse example for your poor daughter. The synchronized attack was a masterclass in narcissistic family dynamics. They were building a shared, impenetrable delusion right in front of my eyes. They were taking all of the hard, undeniable evidence I had just presented and aggressively warping it to fit their preferred narrative. In their minds, Bradley was still the flawless billionaire savior, and I was still the crazy, jealous, impoverished outcast who was desperately trying to tear down their joy. I stood my ground, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I did not raise my voice to shout over their chaotic screaming. I did not flinch when Kiara threw the shredded paper at me. I simply let them exhaust themselves watching their frantic, desperate performance with absolute chilling detachment. If I am a pathological liar, I said softly, timing my words perfectly during a brief lull in their screaming. If I am just a jealous, broke single mother who printed fake bank statements at a local copy center, then why is the brilliant tech visionary standing behind you entirely speechless? I tilted my head, looking past my father's broad shoulders to lock eyes with Bradley again. Why has he not said a single word to defend himself? If his company is thriving, why is he not laughing in my face right now? Why is he sweating through his expensive designer shirt? My mother immediately stepped in to run interference, refusing to let me put Bradley on the spot. He is silent because he is absolutely appalled by your audacity, she snapped, waving her hands dismissively. He is far too much of a gentleman to stoop to your gutter level and engage in a screaming match with a hysterical woman. He is in shock that someone could be so vindictive to their own blood. He is not in shock, Mother, I corrected her, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than the total collapse of their social standing. He is calculating. He is trying to figure out exactly how much time he has left to pack his bags and flee the state before the federal investigators freeze his personal passport. That is it! You are leaving this house immediately! My father roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. I will not stand here and listen to you hurl these disgusting, baseless lies at a man who has brought nothing but honor and prestige to the Williams name. You are a jealous, bitter dropout. You have brought nothing but shame to this family since the day you decided you were too good for our advice. You are entirely dead to us, Maya. You hear me. I never want to see your face in this neighborhood again. Kiara peeked out from her mother's embrace, her tear-stained face twisting into a nasty, triumphant sneer. You heard him, Maya. Get out. Go back to your sad little life and your sad little job, and do not ever come near my husband or my children again. You are a complete and total failure, and nobody here believes a single word that comes out of your mouth. I looked at the three of them standing together in a tight, protective huddle around the man who was actively destroying their entire financial future. They were so blinded by their desperate need for status, so addicted to the illusion of Bradley's wealth, that they were willing to aggressively defend the very person who had just pushed them off a financial cliff. They thought they were winning the argument. They thought they had successfully crushed my rebellion by shutting me down and labeling me a liar. They had absolutely no idea that I possessed an entire folder full of authentic, legally binding documents. They did not know that the paper Kiara had just ripped to shreds was merely a photocopy, and that the real trap had not even been fully sprung yet. I let them hurl their final insults. I let them savor their hollow, pathetic victory. I was simply waiting for the perfect moment for my father to make his fatal, irreversible mistake. The air in the grand foyer was thick with their misplaced triumph. My father stood tall, his chest puffed out under his silk pajamas, fully believing he had just delivered the ultimate killing blow to my credibility. He looked at me not as a daughter, but as a defeated enemy who had foolishly tried to breach his fortress. He wanted absolute destruction. It was not enough for him to simply call me a liar and order me off his property. Marcus Williams was a man ruled entirely by his fragile ego and his desperate need for social supremacy. He needed to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was the smartest, wealthiest, and most powerful man in any room. He needed to crush my narrative with what he believed was an undeniable, insurmountable financial truth. You come in here talking about frozen accounts and unpaid rent, my father sneered, taking another aggressive step forward. The marble floor seemed to echo with the heavy weight of his arrogance. You throw around terms like insolvency because you read a business article online and think you suddenly understand how high-level corporate finance works. You understand absolutely nothing, Maya. You are completely out of your depth. I maintained my silence. I kept my posture relaxed and my expression entirely unreadable. I was letting the rope spool out, giving him all the slack he needed to hang himself. Bradley's company is not failing. My father bellowed, his voice bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and filling the massive space with his booming confidence. He threw a proud, expansive gesture toward the man cowering on the staircase. Innovate Tech is perfectly fine. In fact, it is stronger than ever. And do you want to know why? Because real families, successful families, support each other through strategic growth phases. My mother shifted nervously for a fraction of a second. She reached out and lightly touched my father's arm, a silent, panicked warning not to disclose their private financial affairs to the daughter they deemed unworthy. But my father brushed her hand away with a sharp flick of his wrist. He was too drunk on his own self-righteousness to stop now. He wanted to see my face crumble. He wanted to watch me realize the sheer magnitude of the wealth they had bestowed upon his favorite son-in-law. He wanted to bury me under the weight of his checkbook. Your mother and I mortgaged this very mansion to inject $2 million of liquid capital into his operations just last month, my father announced, proudly delivering his fatal blow. He planted his hands on his hips, a smug, deeply satisfied grin stretching across his face. $2 million, Maya. Cash. Handed directly over to ensure his global expansion continues without a single hiccup. With elite financial backing like that from this family, his company cannot possibly fail. The confession hung in the air, heavy and absolute. He had said it loud and clear. He had willingly mortgaged the roof over his head, the ultimate symbol of his country club status, the very imported Italian marble we were currently standing on, just to feed the bottomless pit of Bradley's fraudulent tech startup. If a camera were gliding sideways right now, tracking smoothly from my father's flushed, boasting face across the physical space between us to land directly on my completely unbothered expression, it would have captured the exact beautiful moment his entire world unknowingly ended. I did not gasp. I did not act shocked. I slowly turned my head, my gaze tracking deliberately away from my father and sliding over to my mother. Denise had quickly recovered from her initial hesitation. Now that the secret was out in the open, she decided to eagerly weaponize it. She lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with cruel, unapologetic vindication. "That is right," my mother snapped, leaning hard into the horrific truth. "We leveraged the estate because we believe in Bradley. We believe in Kiara. They are building a legacy, and we are proud to be the primary investors in their brilliant future. That is what real parents do for children who actually deserve it. We secure their success. We do not waste our hard-earned resources on someone who threw her life away and refuses to improve herself." Kiara let out a delighted, mean-spirited laugh from her safe spot on the stairs. She crossed her arms, looking down at me as if I were dirt scraped from the bottom of her expensive designer shoes. "Did you hear that, Maya? $2 million. That is more money than you will ever see in your entire pathetic lifetime. Mom and Dad trust Bradley with their entire net worth because he is a certified genius. You are just a bitter, lonely woman who cannot even afford a decent Easter dress for her kid. You are nothing to them. Bradley is everything." I let their voices wash over me. They were practically tripping over each other to brag about the worst financial decision of their entire lives. They were proudly displaying the noose they had willingly tied around their own necks. In their arrogant minds, an injection of $2 million made Bradley completely untouchable. They believed that throwing cash at a problem simply made the problem disappear, because that was the only way they knew how to navigate the world. To them, wealth was an impenetrable shield. But I was not looking at Kiara anymore. I was not looking at my mother or my father. My eyes were fixed entirely on Bradley. While my family preened and gloated celebrating their massive investment, the supposed tech visionary looked like he was about to physically collapse right there on the carpet. The $2 million had not saved his company. It had not funded a global expansion. It had likely gone straight into paying off immediate aggressive creditors just to keep him out of federal prison for another 30 days. It was a single drop of water in a blazing inferno, and it had evaporated the very second the wire transfer cleared. Bradley knew that I knew. I watched his chest rise and fall in rapid, shallow jerks. He looked at my parents, who were smiling up at him with absolute blind adoration, and then he looked back at me. He was completely trapped in a cage of his own making. If he told them the truth right now, if he admitted that their $2 million was already gone, and the company was still totally bankrupt, they would tear him apart with their bare hands. But if he stayed silent, he knew I was about to drop an anvil on his head. The panic radiating from his body was palpable. $2 million, I repeated softly. The words rolled off my tongue like a sweet, rich melody. I nodded slowly, deliberately, absorbing the information, letting the silence stretch out to maximize his sheer terror. You mortgaged this estate, the house you have spent your entire lives bragging about, the house you used to look down on every single person in this city. You put it all on the line for Innovate Tech. And we would do it again, my father stated fiercely, completely missing the dangerous shifting undercurrent in my tone. Because unlike you, Bradley produces results. He is a winner. He is a man who knows how to multiply wealth and secure our family name. You could learn a thing or two from him instead of standing in my foyer spewing your jealous, fabricated nonsense. I looked around the magnificent space. I took in the sweeping staircase, the custom wrought iron railings, the imported Italian marble beneath my feet, and the massive crystal chandelier hanging high above our heads, catching the morning light. It really was a beautiful house. It was a towering monument to their vanity, built on a deep foundation of absolute cruelty and unyielding judgment. And because of my father's staggering, blinding arrogance, it no longer belonged to him. A winner, I mused quietly, letting a genuine razor-sharp smile finally break across my face. I reached down and rested my hand on the manila folder one more time, my fingers tapping lightly against the cardboard cover. That is a fascinating perspective, Dad. It really is. They had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. They had voluntarily connected the dots between their personal wealth and Bradley's corporate ruin on a silver platter. They thought they were crushing me with the sheer scale of their investment. They had absolutely no idea that they had just admitted to signing over their entire lives, their home, and their future directly to my venture capital firm. I stopped moving completely. My hand remained resting lightly on the thick manila folder, but my entire body went perfectly frighteningly still. If a camera were positioned right in front of me, slowly pushing in to capture the exact moment my heart turned entirely to ice, it would have recorded a psychological shift so profound it seemed to alter the very air pressure in the grand foyer. $2 million. The number bounced around the inside of my skull, ringing with a sickening crystal-clear resonance. I looked down at the imported Italian marble beneath my feet. I looked up at the custom wainscoting lining the walls and the massive crystal chandelier casting rainbows across the room. I looked at my mother and father standing there with their chests puffed out in absolute unwavering defiance. They had risked their entire family estate. They had literally bet the roof over their heads, their sacred, closely guarded sanctuary of wealth and privilege, just to save their son-in-law's bruised corporate ego. My mind violently snapped back to yesterday afternoon. I saw my 7-year-old daughter Chloe standing on the edge of the Persian rug, clutching her handmade glittery card. I saw her trembling bottom lip. I heard her small heartbroken whisper asking if she had done something bad. My parents could not spare $20 for a generic plastic toy. They could not spare a single chocolate bunny, a cheap greeting card, or even a kind word for their own flesh and blood granddaughter. But behind closed doors, they had secretly gone to a bank, signed away the deed to this massive, opulent estate, and willingly handed over $2 million to a man who had been lying to them since the day he walked into their lives. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was staggering. It was not just financial neglect. It was a profound, deeply malicious, emotional violence directed at an innocent child. They did not just favor Kiara and her children. They actively despised my daughter simply because she was an extension of me. They wanted to punish me through her, making sure she felt the exact same rejection they had spent 3 decades forcing down my throat. Kiara watched my absolute silence and greedily misinterpreted it as total, crushing devastation. She thought she had finally broken me. She thought the revelation of their immense financial backing had shattered my spirit and proven my insignificance once and for all. She took a step down the grand staircase, her manicured hand gripping the polished mahogany banister, leaning forward like a vulture preparing to pick the meat off a carcass. "Yes, Maya," Kiara said, her voice dripping with such venomous, unrestrained cruelty that it almost sounded demonic, echoing in the large space. "They mortgaged the house. They gave Bradley everything because he actually deserves it. You can stand there and look as shocked and pathetic as you want, but this is the reality of your miserable life. They would rather throw millions of dollars at my husband than give a single solitary cent to your useless child." Useless. The word hung in the grand foyer, sharp, jagged, and dripping with poison. I did not gasp. I did not scream. I slowly shifted my gaze away from my sister and looked directly at my mother and father, waiting for them to correct her. I waited for the grandparents of that sweet, bright, loving little girl to turn around and scold Kiara for calling a child useless. I gave them one final silent opportunity to demonstrate a single shred of basic human decency. But the correction never came. My mother simply adjusted her heavy silk robe, her chin held high, looking entirely unapologetic. My father crossed his arms tighter over his chest, his silence acting as a booming, undeniable endorsement of Kiara's vile statement. They agreed with her. They truly believed that Chloe, My beautiful, kind, intelligent daughter was completely worthless, simply because she did not fit into their twisted status-obsessed narrative. Because she was my child, she was collateral damage they were perfectly happy to discard. In that exact moment, any microscopic trace of residual guilt I might have harbored about destroying their lives evaporated into the cold morning air. If my parents had simply been foolish, naive victims of Bradley's elaborate corporate fraud, I might have felt a fleeting second of human pity for them. I might have felt a tiny pang of sorrow watching two elderly people lose their beloved home to a smooth-talking con artist. But they were not victims. They were willing, eager participants in a system of absolute cruelty. They had funded this disaster with their own malice. They had mortgaged their future to buy superiority, and they had stepped on my daughter's heart to make themselves feel taller. Bradley, however, was not celebrating this supposed victory. While Kiara smirked from the stairs, and my parents stood tall in the foyer, the tech chief executive officer looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, listening to the executioner pull the lever. He knew exactly what Kiara's big mouth had just done. He knew that by insulting my daughter, she had just obliterated any tiny chance of mercy I might have possessed. He reached out a trembling hand and weakly grabbed his wife's arm, desperately trying to physically pull her back up the stairs and away from the confrontation. "Kiara, stop!" he hissed, his voice cracking with absolute, unadulterated terror. "Just stop talking right now. Please." But Kiara shook him off violently, completely drunk on her own perceived superiority. She had no idea the cliff she was happily dancing on. "Do not tell me to stop, Bradley," she snapped, glaring down at me with fiery, triumphant eyes. "She needs to hear this. She needs to understand that she has absolutely no power here. She thinks she can just march into our house and threaten us with fake papers and loud accusations. She needs to know that Mom and Dad will always choose us. They will always protect us, and they will always leave her exactly where she belongs, at the absolute bottom." I let a slow, deep breath escape my lungs, feeling the cool air fill my chest. The freezing coldness that had paralyzed me just moments before suddenly ignited into a brilliant, blinding focus. I was no longer just a creditor collecting a corporate debt. I was a mother delivering karma in its purest, most concentrated form. I was the architect of their total ruin, and they were handing me the sledgehammer. I looked at Kiara, taking in her designer robe, her perfect hair, and the arrogant tilt of her chin. Then I looked at my mother, who was watching me with a smug, victorious smile, fully believing she had just won the ultimate psychological war. I looked at my father, who was standing tall, deeply proud of his decision to bet his entire estate on a white savior who was currently sweating through his expensive linen shirt. They had built a towering fortress of lies, and they were so incredibly proud of it. They loved the walls they had constructed. They loved the view from the top. They loved the way the shadow of their wealth fell over me and my daughter. I let a slow, terrifying smile creep across my face. It was a smile that contained absolutely zero joy, a smile that made Kiara's triumphant expression falter mid-sentence. My mother's smug look, cracked, slightly replaced by a sudden creeping unease. Even my father uncrossed his arms, his instincts finally registering that something in the room had fundamentally dangerously shifted. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Kiara," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that carried perfectly through the silent house. "You think this mansion, this money, and this man make you completely untouchable? You think your parents throwing $2 million into a black hole makes you royalty?" I reached out and rested both of my hands flat on top of the manila folder. I leaned forward, letting my eyes lock onto my father's confused face. "You threw away everything you owned to save his pride," I stated softly, letting the reality of their decision hang in the air. "You handed over the deed to your legacy just so you could look down on my child. But there is a very critical detail about high-level corporate finance that you seem to have completely overlooked in your rush to play the generous investor." I tapped my fingernail against the cardboard cover of the folder. The sharp, rhythmic clicking sounded like a ticking clock marking the final seconds of their affluent lives. I kept my eyes pinned on my father, watching the absolute certainty drain out of him, drop by drop. "When a company is as catastrophically insolvent as Innovate Tech," I explained, articulating every single word with deadly precision, When a company is facing millions in unpaid payroll, commercial eviction, and frozen accounts, a $2 million cash injection does not trigger a global expansion. It does not go toward research and development. It does not save the company. I turn my head very slowly, locking my gaze back onto Bradley, who looked like he was about to physically vomit over the mahogany banister. It gets immediately swallowed whole by the company's primary secured debt holder. I finished, my voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. And you should probably ask your brilliant visionary son-in-law who exactly bought up all of his toxic debt from the bank 3 months ago. The absolute silence that followed my question was unlike anything I had ever experienced in that house. It was not the quiet of a peaceful Sunday morning, but the terrifying, suffocating vacuum that occurs right before a massive explosion. Bradley looked as if all the bones in his body had suddenly dissolved. His hands gripped the mahogany banister so tightly, his knuckles were stark white, and his breath came in rapid, shallow gasps. He knew. He knew exactly who had bought his debt. But hearing me say it out loud in front of the people he had spent years conning completely broke his mind. I looked at my father, whose arrogant scowl was slowly morphing into a mask of profound, disorienting confusion. He looked from Bradley to me, trying to process a reality that fundamentally contradicted every single thing he believed about the world. He opened his mouth to demand an explanation, to assert his dominance one more time, but he could not find the words. And then I laughed. It started as a low, quiet chuckle in the back of my throat, but it quickly bubbled up into a genuine, full-throated laugh that echoed off the imported Italian marble and soared up to the crystal chandelier. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent 34 years being treated like dirt, finally watching the universe deliver an impeccable poetic masterpiece of karma. The sound of my laughter seemed to physically tilt the room. The entire grand foyer felt like it was spinning off its axis, the floor dropping out from beneath their feet while I stood perfectly solidly grounded. My mother flinched as if my laughter was a physical blow. "What is so funny?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with mounting panic. "What are you talking about, Maya? Bradley, tell her to stop laughing right now." I did not stop. I reached down, grabbed the bottom edge of the thick manila folder, and flipped it entirely upside down. A waterfall of official, notarized, heavily stamped financial documents cascaded through the air, raining down onto the Persian rug, burying the torn pieces of Bradley's worthless $10,000 check. There were dozens of them. Debt transfer agreements, lien notifications, deeds of trust, and corporate insolvency filings. I threw the empty cardboard folder onto the pile, letting the sheer volume of his financial destruction sit right at my father's feet. Who do you think bought the $2 million bad debt from the bank to prevent his immediate liquidation? I asked, my voice slicing clean through the remaining tension in the room. When the primary commercial lenders looked at Innovate Tech's fraudulent bookkeeping and decided to cut their losses. Who do you think stepped in to acquire the commercial paper for pennies on the dollar? My father stared down at the documents, his eyes catching the bold embossed letterhead on the top page. It read, "Vanguard Apex Ventures. You have spent your entire lives convincing yourselves that I am a pathetic, low-level administrative assistant." I continued, taking a deliberate step forward, forcing my father to take a step back. You needed to believe I was struggling so you could feel superior. You needed to believe I was a failure so you could justify idolizing a white con artist who speaks in empty corporate buzzwords. I pointed a finger directly at Bradley, who was now sinking down onto the staircase, pulling at his own hair. "I am the founder and sole managing partner of Vanguard Apex Ventures," I announced. The words hit the room with the force of a freight train. I manage a portfolio worth over $50 million. I specialize in distressed corporate assets. And 3 months ago, when Bradley's primary lender was preparing to drag him into federal court for commercial default, my firm swooped in and purchased his entire debt portfolio. I own every single outstanding loan, every corporate credit line, and every leveraged asset attached to Innovate Tech. Kiara let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before, and then she turned violently toward her husband. "Bradley, tell me she is lying," Kiara screamed, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him hard. "Tell me this is a joke. Tell me you do not owe her money. Bradley could not look at her. He buried his face in his hands, completely defeated. It is true, he whispered, his voice muffled and broken. The bank sold the debt. The new holding company was a blind trust. I did not know it was her. I swear to God, Kiara, I did not know it was her firm until she walked in here today. My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail, her hands flying up to grip her own hair. She stumbled backward, bumping into the wall, her perfect facade entirely shattered. No, 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 this cannot be happening, she sobbed, looking wildly at my father. Marcus, do something. Tell her this is illegal. But Marcus Williams was not looking at his wife. He was staring down at the documents on the floor, specifically at a piece of paper that detailed the recent $2 million capital injection he had been bragging about just minutes ago. His chest was heaving, his face a terrifying shade of purple. The gears in his head were finally turning, calculating the horrifying reality of what he had actually done. You want to know the absolute best part about all of this? I asked, my voice dropping back to that lethal conversational whisper. You want to know the absolute sweetest irony of this entire morning? I stepped right up to my father, looking him dead in the eyes. When you and Mom went to the bank last month, I said, making sure every syllable landed with maximum impact. When you secretly signed away the deed to this magnificent estate, when you drained your retirement accounts to inject $2 million of liquid cash into Innovate Tech to save his pride. That money did not go toward global expansion. It did not go toward hiring new developers. My father swallowed hard, his eyes locked onto mine, trapped in the nightmare. Because my firm holds the primary secured debt, I explained slowly, smiling, as the light completely died in his eyes. Any cash injected into his insolvent company is legally required to be immediately seized and routed to the primary creditor to satisfy outstanding arrears. I leaned in closer, dropping my voice so only he could hear the final, devastating blow. You did not invest in Bradley's future, Dad. You paid his overdue bills directly to my company. You took the equity out of the house you used to make me feel worthless, and you literally wrote a $2 million check directly to my venture capital firm. You funded my business to save his pride. My father staggered backward, as if I had driven a physical blade into his chest. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to reach out and grab the marble console table just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The great, powerful patriarch, the man who had just threatened to throw me out onto the street and leave me to starve, had just realized he had voluntarily handed his entire fortune over to the daughter he despised. Kiara shrieked again, dropping to her knees on the stairs and violently hitting Bradley's arm. You idiot! She screamed, her voice cracking with pure selfish hysteria. You absolute idiot! You lost everything. You lost my parents' house. You gave her everything. What are we going to do? Where are we going to live? You promised me a mansion. Bradley did not fight back. He just sat there, absorbing the physical and verbal blows from the woman who only loved him for his imaginary bank account. The golden couple was shattering into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. My mother slid down the wall, sitting on the floor in her expensive silk robe, openly weeping. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, pleading terror. Maya, please, she choked out, holding her hands up in a pathetic, begging gesture. Please, you cannot do this to us. This is our home. We are your parents. You cannot take our home away from us. We made a mistake. We were just trying to help family. Help family. I repeated, the smile fading from my face, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. You mean like how you helped Chloe yesterday when you purposefully skipped over her to hand out cash to Kiara's kids? Or do you mean how you helped me when you forced me to sell my car so Kiara could drink wine in Paris? I looked at the three of them, a pathetic, broken pile of arrogance and greed. You built this entire family on the belief that money makes you superior, I said, looking down at my father, who was still clutching the table, gasping for air. You worshipped wealth so blindly that you handed your entire life over to a man who possessed nothing but a good suit and a white face. You chose your prejudices over your own daughter. You chose your ego over your own granddaughter. I turned around, my heels crunching over the scattered, torn pieces of Bradley's worthless check. I walked toward the heavy mahogany front door, the exact door my father had tried to throw me out of just 15 minutes ago. I grabbed the brass handle and pulled it open, letting the bright, crisp morning sunlight flood into the dark, suffocating foyer. "I am not taking your home away from you," I said, looking back over my shoulder one last time at the family that had tried to destroy me. "You handed it to me on a silver platter. And as the primary creditor of Innovate Tech, I will be exercising my legal right to liquidate all corporate assets and attached collateral." I stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the fresh, clean air. "You have 30 days to vacate my property," I announced. "Have a wonderful Easter weekend." I closed the door behind me with a firm, definitive click, leaving them locked inside the tomb of their own making. The firm click of the mahogany door shutting behind me lasted only a fraction of a second before the heavy wood was violently yanked open again. I had barely made it halfway down the sweeping concrete steps when I heard the frantic slapping sound of Bradley's suede slippers rushing out onto the portico. "Maya, wait. Please, you have to wait." His voice was completely stripped of its previous smooth arrogance. It was a high, reedy sound, the desperate plea of a man who was watching his entire existence evaporate into thin air. I stopped on the bottom step and turned around slowly. The crisp morning sunlight caught the terrified glint in his eyes. He looked absolutely pathetic, leaning heavily against one of the massive white pillars framing the entryway, just to keep himself upright. I walked back up the stairs, my heels striking the stone with deliberate, measured precision. I did not stop until I was sharing the same immediate physical space with him on the grand porch. I began to pace slowly around him. If a camera were tracking my movements, it would capture a tight, continuous circle, framing me as the undeniable predator and him as the cornered, exhausted prey. "You cannot just walk away and liquidate everything," Bradley stammered, twisting his hands together. "You are a venture capitalist, Maya. You understand the tech sector. You know that asset liquidation is a scorched earth tactic. It destroys value. We can negotiate terms. I can offer you equity. I can give you a seat on the board. We can restructure the debt into preferred shares. I have a major acquisition in the pipeline." I continued my slow, predatory circle around him, letting my eyes rake over his disheveled appearance. It was genuinely fascinating to watch a man who had built his entire identity on corporate buzzwords try to use those same hollow phrases to save his life. He was throwing out terms like equity and restructuring as if they held any actual magic. He was completely oblivious to the fact that I held all the cards and knew every single intimately dirty detail of his fraudulent ledger. "A major acquisition in the pipeline." I repeated, my tone dripping with absolute mockery. "Is that the bedtime story you have been telling yourself, Bradley? Or is that just the lie you sold to my desperate, socially climbing parents?" Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically as I walked behind him, forcing him to crane his neck just to keep me in his line of sight. "It is not a lie," he insisted, though his voice was shaking so violently the words barely formed. "I have been in advanced talks for months. A massive buyout." I stopped circling and stepped directly into his personal space, backing him up against the cold stone pillar. He shrank away from me, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. "You told them a major investment fund was about to acquire your company to reassure them before mortgaging the house, right?" I asked, locking my gaze onto his terrified eyes. He nodded frantically, desperate to validate his fabricated lifeline. "Yes. Yes, exactly." I showed Marcus the preliminary term sheets. I proved to him that a massive institutional buyer was preparing a buyout that would multiply his $2 million investment tenfold. I just needed the bridge capital to survive the compliance audit until the acquisition cleared. "The deal is real, Maya. The fund is real." I let a slow, terrifyingly cold smile spread across my face. I leaned in just a fraction of an inch closer, ensuring that my next words would echo in his nightmares for the rest of his miserable life. "You were right," I whispered, my voice completely devoid of mercy. "That fund is mine." The last remaining drop of blood vanished from Bradley's face. He turned a shade of pale that I had never seen on a living human being. His mouth fell open, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. The realization hit him with the kinetic force of a speeding train. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated horror as the entire scope of my trap finally made sense to his desperate brain. He had not been negotiating with a faceless corporate entity. He had been unknowingly pitching his fraudulent, bankrupt company directly to me for the past 6 months. "You sent those fake, highly inflated revenue projections to my analysts," I stated systematically, dismantling the very last pillar of his delusion. "You sat in your leased Silicon Valley office that you could not afford, and you pitched a fairy tale to my acquisitions team. You submitted forged user engagement metrics. You lied about your recurring revenue. You fabricated an entire roster of enterprise clients that do not actually exist." Bradley began to shake his head in slow robotic denial, unable to process the magnitude of his own catastrophic failure. "My firm initiated the acquisition talks," I continued, my voice ringing with total, unshakable authority. "I ordered my team to string you along. I instructed them to send you those preliminary term sheets because I knew exactly what you would do with them. I knew you would take those documents, run straight to my desperate, status-obsessed father, and use them as bait to drain his retirement accounts and mortgage this estate. You set me up." Bradley choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "You orchestrated this whole thing." "You set yourself up, Bradley," I corrected him sharply. "I simply bought a front-row seat to your implosion. You are the one who burned through investor cash to buy sports cars and luxury vacations for Kiara. You are the one who committed federal wire fraud by lying on your financial disclosures. All I did was purchase your debt from a bank that was already preparing to refer your case to the Securities and Exchange Commission." I stepped back, allowing the morning sunlight to fully illuminate the total wreckage of the man standing before me. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable tech genius who had offered me a $10,000 charity check. He was a cornered criminal who knew he was about to lose his freedom. "Do you understand the position you are in right now?" I asked, crossing my arms over my chest. "I am not just your primary creditor. I am the entity holding the very evidence of your corporate fraud. When I file the liquidation paperwork on Monday morning, I will be legally obligated to turn over all of your falsified financial disclosures to the federal authorities." Bradley's knees finally gave out. He slid slowly down the smooth white surface of the pillar, collapsing onto the cold concrete of the portico. He brought his hands up to his face, burying his head between his knees as he let out a loud, wretched sob. The polished, superior facade was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic reality of a man who had built his life on stolen money and lies. "Maya, please," he begged, his voice muffled by his hands. "Please, I will do anything. I will sign the company over to you completely. I will walk away with nothing. Just do not send the documents to the authorities. Do not send me to prison. I cannot go to prison." I looked down at the top of his head with absolute disgust. He was not apologizing for what he had done to my family's finances. He was not apologizing for the cruel way he had treated me and my daughter. He was only crying because he had finally been caught, and he was terrified of facing the actual consequences of his actions. "You should have thought about prison before you decided to play billionaire with other people's money," I said coldly. "You sat in that foyer 10 minutes ago and tried to lecture me about hard work and success. You let my parents humiliate me, and you smiled while they did it. You thought your white privilege and your stolen wealth made you invincible." I turned away from him, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete as I walked back toward my car. "The liquidation happens on Monday," I called out over my shoulder, not bothering to look back at his pathetic, crumpled form. "I highly suggest you spend the rest of this beautiful Easter weekend finding a very good criminal defense attorney. You are going to need one." Before I could reach the driver's side door of my sedan, the heavy mahogany front doors burst open again. My father stumbled out onto the grand portico, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. My mother was right behind him, gripping his arm to keep herself steady while Kiara lingered in the doorway, her eyes darting frantically between my calm posture and her husband crumpled on the cold concrete. They had followed us outside, unable to simply sit in the wreckage of their foyer without demanding a final, desperate explanation. They needed someone to tell them there was a loophole, a hidden clause, a magical reset button that would somehow restore their $2 million and their pristine social standing. Maya, my father yelled, his voice cracking with a raw, unfamiliar panic. He completely ignored Bradley sobbing on the ground. You cannot just leave. We need to sit down like rational adults and figure out a restructuring plan. We can negotiate terms. You are a businesswoman. You know that bankrupting this family serves no strategic purpose. We can sell the company assets. We can salvage the investment. I paused with my hand resting on the car door handle. I turned around to face them, letting my gaze sweep over the entire pathetic tableau. My father was sweating profusely, his silk pajamas clinging to his frame. My mother was trembling visibly, her perfectly manicured hands shaking against her chest. Kiara looked entirely hollowed out, staring at Bradley as if he were a complete stranger. "There is absolutely nothing left to negotiate, Dad," I stated, my voice slicing through the crisp morning air with absolute precision. I took a few deliberate steps back toward the portico, closing the distance just enough to make sure every single word landed exactly where it was intended. You are standing there talking about restructuring a company that has not produced a single viable product in over a year. You are begging to salvage an investment that was completely vaporized the moment you authorized the wire transfer. But the acquisition, Kiara shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical wail. She rushed past our parents and pointed a trembling finger at Bradley. He said a major fund was buying the company. He showed us the paperwork. Even if you hold the debt, the new buyers will inject capital. We can get our money back from the acquisition payout. I stopped walking. I locked eyes with my sister, feeling a profound, icy calm settle over my entire body. I watched her desperately cling to the very illusion I had engineered. "I want you to look very closely at my face, Kiara," I commanded, dropping my voice to a terrifying, absolute hush. "I want you to look into my eyes and tell me if you see a single trace of mercy." Kiara froze, her breath hitching in her throat. My gaze was a physical weight pressing down on her, stripping away the last remaining layers of her denial. "There is no mystery buyer," I explained, delivering the truth with surgical brutality. "There is no white knight coming to save your husband. My firm sent those acquisition term sheets. I authorized my team to draft those preliminary offers specifically to see how far Bradley would go to cover up his massive fraud. He took that bait, and he dragged you and our parents right over the cliff with him." Bradley let out a wretched guttural groan from the concrete, pulling his knees tightly against his chest. He knew what was coming next. "And I just signed the order rejecting the acquisition and initiating liquidation at 6 a.m. this morning," I announced. The words rang out with definitive, unshakable authority. "The documents have already been filed with the commercial courts. The asset seizure teams are locking down his servers right now. You are done, Bradley. There is no coming back from this." The gravity of the 6 o'clock decision finally crushed the last remaining spark of hope in my father's eyes. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The $2 million he had secretly mortgaged his estate for was not tied up in a transitional phase. It was not waiting for a corporate buyout. It was gone, entirely legally seized by my firm to cover a fraction of his son-in-law's massive fraudulent debt. "No," my mother wailed, her legs finally giving out beneath her. She collapsed onto the top step of the grand portico, her heavy silk robe pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, uncontrollable sobs. "We are going to lose the house. Marcus, we are going to lose everything. The country club, our friends, our entire life. How could you let this happen?" She was not crying because her family was fractured. She was not shedding a single tear for the years of emotional abuse she had inflicted on me, or the cruelty she had shown to Chloe. Denise Williams was weeping exclusively for her impending poverty. She was crying because the elite social status she worshipped above all else was currently burning to the ground right in front of her. My father stood completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the massive white pillars of the house he no longer owned. His jaw was slack, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The great untouchable patriarch had been thoroughly dismantled by his own blinding arrogance and his desperate need to impress a white con artist. Kiara sank down onto the stairs next to our mother, pulling her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth in a state of total catatonic shock. The golden child, who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, was now facing a future entirely stripped of her designer clothes, her luxury vacations, and her unearned superiority. I stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the four of them. They looked incredibly small, a pathetic, broken cluster of people who had built their entire universe on lies and conditional love. I didn't come here at 7 a.m. to start a fight. I said, my voice echoing clearly over my mother's loud, desperate sobbing. I did not come here to argue about my career or defend my choices or beg for a seat at your table. I pulled my car keys from my pocket, the metal clinking sharply in the morning quiet. I came to deliver a foreclosure notice myself, I stated, ensuring the absolute finality of my words resonated in their ears. You chose to humiliate a 7-year-old girl yesterday, just to prove how much power you had over me. You looked at my daughter, saw her holding a handmade card, and you deliberately chose to break her heart so you could feel tall. I turned around, opened my car door, and paused for one final second. The price of making my daughter cry is higher than you imagined, I said, not bothering to look back at the wreckage. You have 30 days to vacate my property. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove smoothly down the sweeping circular driveway. As I turned out of the gated community, the heavy dark weight that I had carried on my shoulders for my entire life completely vanished. I drove toward the city, toward the beautiful, bright morning, eager to get back to my own home, eager to make a massive stack of pancakes, and incredibly eager to give my perfect daughter the absolute best Easter Sunday of her entire life. The heavy mahogany front door of the estate clicked shut in my memory. A sharp, seamless visual transition snapped that pristine white wood into a thin, peeling veneered door, slamming violently against a cheap metal frame. 3 months had passed since that Easter Sunday. The grand, sprawling estate that had stood as the ultimate monument to the Williams family ego no longer belonged to them. By the end of that first 30-day notice, the eviction had been executed with ruthless clinical efficiency. I did not attend the final walkthrough. I sent my legal team and a property management crew to oversee the transition. The massive crystal chandeliers, the imported Italian marble, and the custom wainscoting were systematically stripped of their pretension, photographed, and listed in the corporate asset ledger. The property was quickly sold to a real estate developer who planned to gut the interior entirely. The physical representation of my parents' overwhelming vanity was completely erased from the elite gated community they had worshipped. Their country club memberships were revoked due to unpaid dues. The high society friends they had spent decades trying to impress stopped returning their phone calls the exact moment the foreclosure hit the local public records. As for the brilliant tech visionary, Bradley did exactly what cowards do when cornered. He ran. Less than 48 hours after our confrontation on the portico, while my firm's asset seizure team was locking down his corporate servers, he emptied whatever meager funds remained in his hidden personal accounts and boarded an international flight. He abandoned his failing empire, he abandoned his web of lies, and most notably, he abandoned Kiara. He left his prized, demanding wife holding the bag for a mountain of secondary personal debts that had been opened in her name to fund their lavish lifestyle. The luxury cars were repossessed right out of the driveway. The designer handbags and jewelry were seized to satisfy aggressive credit card companies. The golden child who had spent her entire existence looking down on me for working hard was suddenly drowning in legal notices and collection calls with absolutely zero marketable skills to fall back on. The mighty Williams family, utterly destitute and stripped of their false pride, had been forced to relocate to a cramped, dilapidated 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. The thin walls offered zero insulation from the reality of their new life. The space was suffocatingly small, forcing Marcus, Denise, and Kiara to constantly trip over each other and their massive bruised egos. Without me there to serve as their designated punching bag, the deeply toxic ecosystem they had built completely cannibalized itself. The family quickly turned their vicious, judgmental tendencies entirely inward. Every single day was an absolute battleground. My father, stripped of his patriarchal authority, and his bank account paced the cramped linoleum floors, bitterly blaming his wife for trusting a con artist. My mother, completely bereft of her social standing, directed all of her blistering rage directly at the daughter she used to worship. Kiara, who had once been the flawless, untouchable center of their universe, was now the daily target of their absolute resentment. "You ruined us, Kiara!" my mother shrieked one humid afternoon, her voice easily carrying through the thin drywall to the neighbors next door. "You brought that criminal into our home. You demanded the Paris trips, the designer clothes, and the luxury cars. You forced us to mortgage our entire lives just to keep him happy so you could play the wealthy socialite. We lost everything because of your absolute greed." Kiara screamed right back, her voice raw and hysterical, completely stripped of its former arrogant polish. "You are the ones who handed him the money. You are the ones who were so obsessed with having a white tech chief executive officer in the family that you did not even bother to check his financial statements. Do not you dare blame me for your own pathetic social climbing. You pushed Maya away. You handed her the very weapon she used to destroy us. I gave you everything," my father bellowed, joining the chaotic screaming match from the tiny, cramped kitchen. "I built a legacy, and you two completely squandered it. I am spending my retirement years living like a peasant because neither of you had the sense to see through a cheap suit and a business degree." They were trapped in a miserable, suffocating prison entirely of their own making. The golden child had officially lost her shine, and the parents who had worshipped her were now choking on the rust. There was no escape from the poverty, no escape from the endless collection calls, and absolutely no escape from each other. The very traits they had celebrated in one another, the arrogance, the superficiality, and the relentless greed, were now the exact tools they used to tear each other apart day after agonizing day. The harsh, biting cold of my parents' manufactured reality dissolved entirely into a brilliant golden warmth. Sunlight spilled across the wide plank hardwood floors of our new home, casting long, peaceful shadows through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. There were no gaudy crystal chandeliers here, no imported marble floors intentionally designed to make visitors feel small, inadequate, and acutely aware of their social standing. Instead, the expansive living space was completely filled with the rich, comforting sounds of genuine laughter, the light clinking of glasses, and the easy, unforced conversations of people who actually cared deeply about one another. I stood near the large open kitchen island, simply taking a moment to watch the beautiful scene unfold before me. My gaze drifted slowly across the room, panning smoothly from face to face, capturing nothing but pure, unadulterated joy. My business partner, Jordan, was leaning casually against the counter, telling a hilarious animated story to a group of my closest friends and top investors. There were no hushed, judgmental whispers hiding in the corners. There were no performative, aggressive displays of wealth meant to establish a toxic hierarchy. The people filling my sunlit living room were my chosen family. They were the mentors who had believed in my vision when I had nothing, the friends who had supported me during the lean, exhausting years, and the partners who respected my intellect and my relentless drive. They loved me for exactly who I was, not for what I could buy them, or how I could artificially elevate their public reputation. In the very center of the room, sitting comfortably on a plush, woven area rug, was the absolute center of my universe. Chloe was surrounded by a small, attentive circle of people who adored her without any conditions. Jordan's wife, Sarah, knelt gently beside her, handing her a beautifully wrapped square box tied perfectly with a bright yellow ribbon. This was not a weaponized, performative gift exchange designed to crush a child's spirit. There was no cruel audience demanding a theatrical display of gratitude, and there were absolutely no strings attached to the present. It was just a simple, beautiful, and pure moment of giving. I held my breath slightly as I watched Chloe carefully untie the yellow ribbon. She did not look around nervously, wondering if she was allowed to be happy. She did not hesitate or shrink into herself, fearing that she was about to be excluded or mocked. She confidently pulled away the wrapping paper and lifted the lid of the box. Inside was a custom professional-grade art set, complete with dozens of vibrant watercolors, high-quality imported brushes, and thick textured sketchbooks. It was exactly the specific set she had been talking about for months. It was a gift chosen by someone who actually took the time to listen to her, who paid close attention to her passions, and who genuinely wanted to nurture her growing creativity. Chloe's face lit up with a smile so bright and so fiercely beautiful that it completely outshone the afternoon sun pouring through the windows. She looked up, her brown eyes sparkling with pure, unburdened delight. There were no tears of confusion pooling in her eyes today. There was no crushing, humiliating rejection. There was only the absolute, unwavering certainty that she was seen, valued, and deeply loved by every single person in this house. She scrambled quickly to her feet, leaving the open box safely on the rug, and sprinted across the room toward me. She threw her small arms around my waist, burying her face into my side, hugging me so incredibly tightly that I could feel the fierce, beautiful rhythm of her little heart beating against me. I dropped my hand to her head, smoothing down her hair, and pulled her close, wrapping my arms around her shoulders. I rested my chin on the top of her head, closing my eyes and breathing in the sweet, familiar scent of my perfect daughter. In that quiet, flawless embrace, surrounded by the warmth of my true community, I felt the absolute triumph of my choices. I had successfully shielded her from a lifetime of conditional love and toxic, soul-crushing comparisons. I had built an impenetrable fortress of genuine support where she would never have to doubt her own worth or question her place in the world. Family is not defined by shared DNA. Family is those who never let your child wonder, "What did I do wrong?" That time I didn't scream. I simply took away everything that fed their arrogance.